Not in terribly good voice tonight. I've been kind of fighting a little bit of a cold, but we'll see. I'll try not to go completely silent on you at some point here. Anyway, it's very kind, and it is wonderful to be back. I was saying to someone a minute ago, looking around the room, I see lots of familiar faces, and that's wonderful. I've really enjoyed coming over here, and I mean, who knows? Maybe I'll be back. You never know what cards life's going to deal you. So as Jim said, I am retiring in May. 41 years has gone by like the twinkling of an eye. It's unbelievable. Seems like I just started the other day, but that was actually a long time ago. And it's funny about the inoculation. I'm just teaching an honors humanities seminar at Notre Dame this semester, and last week with my students we were reading the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. And you may know that Franklin had a 4-year-old son who died of smallpox. And he lamented the fact that he hadn't inoculated his son because he thought that would have saved him. So, I mean, Ben Franklin's advice is to get your inoculations. So, what I want to talk about with you tonight, since we're in the first week of Lent, is Lent. It's sort of its history and some of the traditions and some of the practices. Lent has a very long and a very curious, and very interesting kind of history. So, in a sense, the question, why do we do this? And why do we do the things we do? So that's what basically we're going to talk about. Now, our word Lent, I don't know if I write back here, I don't know if everybody can see. I'll try to write right up on the top. So can you see that? The Old English word Lenten, all right, that's where our word Lent comes from. That word means springtime. You think, well, Lent, springtime. We think of Lent as kind of a dark season, a penitential season. Why would we think of springtime? Well, it's because basically, no matter when, now, of course, Ash Wednesday is pegged on Easter, right? The movable feast, Easter is the first Sunday after the first full moon after the 14th day of the month of Nisan. All right, so Easter moves, and then that pegs where Ash Wednesday falls. But part of Lent will always fall in Lent. Part of Lent will always fall in spring. So now, there's an old German word, it's the same root, Lenz, which is another word for springtime. Now, if you know German, the normal German word for springtime is Frühling. All right, but there's an old German word, Lenz, and you can see that's the same root. It's the same word. So we're talking about springtime, which is an interesting way to think about Lent, because I mean, springtime wouldn't be the first thing that came to mind, right? If I said, what comes to mind if I say Lent? I'll bet springtime wouldn't be the first thing that would come to mind. And of course, the Germans have another word for this, which probably is much closer to what we would think of, Fastenzeit, fasting time. Now that sounds like Lent, doesn't it? There's Lent for you. Now, there are people in the room who I'm going to come to this little chart that I passed around in a minute because it actually shows how to count Lent, which is a matter of some confusion, I think, for lots of people. But there are people here who may remember Quadragesima, all right, which means a 40th, or the time of 40. We're going to come to 40 several times tonight. But you may remember also that you could go back to Septuagesima, Sexagesima, and Quinquagesima, and I'm going to come to that in a few minutes. Quadragesima is the Latin word. If you know French, it's carême. If you know Spanish, quaresma. If you know Italian, quaresima. So the English and Germanic languages are peculiar with this word Lent, because in all of the Romance languages in Latin, the words all come off Quadragesima, which was the Roman Church's word for this liturgical season from about the 5th century, actually until now. Technically, this is Quadragesima, but we now use the word Lent. Now, Lent is a tradition. It is not a matter of dogma. Apart from fast and abstinence, you don't actually have to do anything in Lent. Ash Wednesday, for example, is not a holy day of obligation. Good Friday is, but Good Friday is not. Easter Sunday is. The Sundays in Lent are ordinary days of obligation, but not special. So the point is that obviously Catholicism is full of traditions. We have an enormous number of these, and you've probably heard this before. And actually, the Catechism of the I felt very good about this. I've always taught it this way, and then the Catechism of the Catholic Church used the same language. Capital T and small t traditions. You've probably Somebody has talked about that at some point. So, I mean, capital T traditions are the dogmas of the church. They are the teachings of the magisterium, the creed, for instance. That's not subject to opinion. You can say, well, you know, some of that's okay, but I don't like all of it. I mean, we don't have a choice about such things. But small T traditions are, Lent is one of these, but I mean, Bible stories, for example, the use of Latin, whether or not you ring bells in the liturgy, things like that. Those are small T traditions. We can do that or not. You know, I mean, Gothic architecture. People used to think the Catholic Church had to be Gothic, or else it probably wasn't Catholic. Well, your church isn't Gothic. The one I go to is Romanesque, but you know, but there's a sense, you know what I mean, that Gothic. Kneelers, particularly after the Second Vatican Council, kneelers vanished from a lot of churches. Well, you don't have to have them. In the Middle Ages, there were no kneelers. People stood. People stood. It's very interesting in the canon of Mass, the Eucharistic prayer says to those standing around. The Latin was circumstantes, those standing around. It doesn't say those kneeling. All right. So whether you kneel or you stand, you know, that's tradition. Biblical stories. Bethlehem. They go, excuse me, that's Christmas. Why on earth would Jesus have been born in Bethlehem? His family was from Nazareth, way up north, in the Galilee. Said, well, because they had to go down there and register. You didn't actually have to go anywhere and register for a Roman census. Can you imagine the entire Roman army, for example, saying, see, officer, I got to go register someplace. The book of Micah says, from you, Bethlehem Ephratah, the least of all the tribes of Judah, shall come the one. The Messiah had to come from Bethlehem. Now, there was this little problem that the Messiah's family lived in Nazareth, so they had to get him to Bethlehem somehow. All right, but that's the evidence for Bethlehem. The wise men, how many wise men were there? How do you know that? Sorry? Because you sing the song, right, okay. There's 3 gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But you are never told that there's 3 wise men. It could have been a committee of 10. We're never told that there was 3 wise men. We're told that there's 3 gifts. Now, in the 6th century, they get names. Caspar, Balthazar, and Melchior. You won't find that in Luke or Matthew in the infancy narratives. Traditions. You see? And that's what Lent is. Lent is a tradition. And now it's something that we have held dear for a very long time. But it is not like the creed. It is not like the central tenets of our faith. That doesn't mean, I'm not suggesting for a second that one not take it seriously or just dismiss it. That's not my point. My point is kind of where does it fit? In the early 5th century, Pope Leo I urged people to maintain the apostolic tradition of fasting for 40 days. He was quoting St. Jerome. Now, there is absolutely no evidence that the apostles ever fasted for 40 days. Nor is there any evidence until the Council of Nicaea, 325. So we think of the Council of Nicaea significant because of the Nicene Creed, which we recite. But it was a major church council which issued a lot of legislation. It was actually the first great council of the church. They had a lot of business to conduct. One of the provisions fixed the pre-Easter fast at 40 days. Now, there had been pre-Easter fasts almost everywhere for a very long time, perhaps indeed reaching back to apostolic times. We can't be utterly confident of that, but we know a 40-day fast, we know a 40-hour fast, we know of 3-day fasts. Virtually every town, every community sort of had its own fasting rules. There was no set rule about fasting until the Council of Nicaea at 325 fixed the fast at 40 days. So this 40-day fast dates from 325 and not earlier, but by the early 5th century, Pope St. Jerome and Pope Leo I thought this was apostolic tradition, you see. See how traditions grow and they get built, and eventually they kind of take on a life of their own. All right. Now, after the Edict of Milan, which is issued by the Emperor Constantine in 314, so Christianity is made a licit religion, religio licita. It's made a licit religion in the Roman Empire. It's legal. By the end of that century, of course, Christianity would be made the state religion of the Roman Empire, but it's made legal. It's put on an equal footing with all other religions, the pagan cults, Judaism, etc. This meant that the church could function as a visible public institution. It was no longer subject to persecution, or from the Roman point of view, prosecution. Right? It could function. Now, it's at about that time that we can first glimpse the Catechumenate. There has to have been something like the Catechumenate, the preparation of and introduction of people into the church. There has to have been something like that going on for a long time. But not surprisingly, during the centuries when the church was basically illegal, they were doing very little to call attention to themselves. So we can't see, we can't observe a lot of these phenomena. In the 4th century, we begin to have abundant evidence of this. And we begin to have a time of fasting and preparation immediately prior to Easter when people are going to be received into the church. Okay. Gradually, as we move across the Roman world, we move from a time when the overwhelming majority of people who are being converted, who are joining the church at Easter, who are catechumens, are adults, to a time when the adult population is overwhelmingly already converted, and the majority of people joining the church are infants who can be baptized at any time of the year. All right. So what began to happen is the 40-day preparation for Easter, incumbent upon all, and the special preparation incumbent upon adults being received into the church effectively melded. It became one set of celebrations or observances, and it gradually morphed into what we call Lent. So we have, you see, the pre-Easter fast, which does seem to have deep, deep roots, or old roots, if you will, in the church, even though before Nicaea, there certainly was no consistent set of rules, all right? And then the preparation for adult catechumens. Now, of course, we still prepare adult catechumens in this way, you know, and during the Sundays of Lent, for example, we have the scrutinies. We bring all these people up in front of us and embarrass them. We've been doing that for years. Okay, but so we still retain a sense of what was done a long time ago. But basically, Lent emerged by the 5th and 6th centuries, all right, from a combination of the pre-Easter fast and the preparation of adult catechumens. Those two things kind of came together and formed what we know as Lent. Now, in the 5th and 6th centuries, the 40-day fast became pretty normal. Right? So it was a 40-day fast was enjoined by Nicaea in 325. So that became pretty normal. But the individual practices varied tremendously. So where does the 40 come from? Why 40? I mean, you stop thinking about it. I mean, you pick a number out of a hat. Why 40? All right, that's one. That was in last Sunday's readings, right? So we know about that. Anybody remember any other 40s? Mm-hmm. Noah's Ark. The flood. It rained for 40 days? It rained for 40 days?
40 years in the desert.
40 years in the desert? But 3 weeks ago, Jonah told the citizens of Nineveh they had how many days to repent? 40. Elijah walked how many days to Horeb? 40. The point is, there's 40s all over the place. So it's not merely the 40 days of Christ in the desert when he's tempted and so on. I mean, for some reason, I mean, and I have no explanation for this, I don't know that anybody does, there's 40s all over the place. So it's not so surprising that they would have alighted upon 40. Okay, fair enough, 40. But which 40 days? Now, you can look at the at the chart that I gave you. The chart that I gave you is, and I'm going to come back to some of these other Sundays and so forth, you know, how do you get 40 days? Well, this is very traditional, and this is basically the way things were before the Second Vatican Council. I'm going to tell you a little bit about this kind of an amusing story after that. So Ash Wednesday is day one. You see I had to type some things on there so the numbers vanished. But anyway, so you go from 40 days, from Ash Wednesday through Holy Saturday minus the Sundays, there's your 40. All right, so that's the traditional reckoning of 40 days. Now, the Orthodox Lent runs 40 days from Clean Monday, or Pure Monday, which is the Monday before Ash Wednesday. They don't celebrate Ash Wednesday, they celebrate Clean Monday, all right? It goes 40 days from there, minus 40 days from there to Palm Sunday, including the Sundays. In the Ambrosian rite, so the rite used in the city of Milan, the rite attributed to St. Ambrose, and they still have the privilege in the Archdiocese of Milan. They actually celebrate a slightly different liturgy than we do. I mean, it's recognizable if you went to Mass in Milan, you'd certainly recognize liturgy, but you'd also notice some small differences. Lent begins on the Sunday after Ash Wednesday. They don't celebrate Ash Wednesday in Milan. It begins on the Sunday after, and it runs 40 days, including the Sundays, down to Holy Thursday. And it ends there. In Rome, in the time of Gregory I, Pope Gregory I, he's Pope from 590 to 604, there were 6 weeks of 6 days each. So you had the 6 weeks of Lent, but you didn't include the Sundays. You had 6 days of 6 weeks of 6 days each, 36 days. Gregory said this was a tithe of the year. 365, 336. He said this was a tithe of the year, which is an interesting way to think about it, but yet quite another one. In the 7th century, in the Latin West, Ash Wednesday and the 3 following days were added to make the 40. So actually, the beginning with Ash Wednesday and counting the 40 days from there, as on the chart you have, that starts in the 7th century. So these things go along. Now, since 1969, the Catholic Church has been a little confusing because Lent is 40 days from Ash Wednesday to the Mass of the Lord's Supper. Okay, the Mass of the Lord's Supper is Thursday night. Thursday night is liturgically Friday. So you can't count that day. Okay? So you actually have 44 days because you count the Sundays. And so what did the instruction in 1969 say? 44 days is 40 days approximately for spiritual purposes. I'm quoting. So when is 40 not 40? When it's 44. But the first 2 days of the Paschal Triduum, Good Friday and Holy Saturday, are part of the penitential period that begins on Ash Wednesday and that does not include the Sundays, so now we're back to 40. So anyway, counting your 40 days of Lent can be a fairly tricky sort of exercise. All right, so Lent began with fasting. Right, this one. All right, is that better? Can you tell? Okay. Whoop, I lost my little rubber thing again. Is one of them broadcasting to him and one to them? Can you hear me? Okay. Can you hear me now? That's it. Okay, so Lent begins with fasting. The original observances of Lent, the oldest observances of Lent are fasting. It's the pre-Easter fast, eventually fixed at 40 days. Now, to this, prayer and almsgiving are added over time. So this is the normal teaching today. Lent is the time of prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. All right? But prayer and almsgiving are the ones that were added. Now, fasting rules have changed over time. And there's a lot of really interesting and curious things about the fasting rules. I'll get into a little bit of this. The original idea was for the laity to share for a while in the lifelong fast of monks and clergy. Think about it. You see, monks and clergy were obliged to a lifelong fast, so the laity were to share in this for a period of time. That was also the rationale for Meatless Fridays, which eventually went away. That was to make all of us a little bit like monks and priests. You see? They must renounce all kinds of things all the time, we only occasionally. Now, in the West, well, I should say that fasting was always associated with various forms of abstinence. So fasting is effectively how much you can eat Abstinence is what you can eat. Or to flip it around, how much you're not supposed to eat and what things you're not supposed to eat. But you can see the point. Fasting is how much, abstinence is what, all right? Now, in the West, for example, fasting originally held for one modest meal per day, probably in the mid-afternoon. Now, eventually, a second meal, a light breakfast, called in Latin a collatio. If you've traveled in Italy, what is breakfast called? The prima colazione. See, so that's where that comes from. So a light meal was added earlier in the day. As Christianity spread into Europe and moved north, now I'm sure many of you have traveled in Europe. You've probably traveled in Europe in the summer, and you've noticed that it stays light till 10 or 11 at night, and it gets light again about 4 in the morning. That made for an awfully long day if your only meal was going to be in the middle of that daylight period. Now in the winter, of course, it stays dark till like 10 in the morning and starts getting dark at 4 in the afternoon. It's a different thing. So if you have a meal in the middle of the day, the rest of the time you're sleeping, so it's probably not such a big deal. I mean, it's interesting. It's an adjustment, obviously, to climate and to the hours of sunshine. So a second meal was added. And so now we have these things where, on a day of fasting, you can have one full meal and the other two aren't supposed to add up to more than the other. Now, how many of us get out the kitchen scale and weigh everything? But, it's kind of notional, right? Tradition. Tradition, okay. Canon law says that there is to be fasting and abstinence on Ash Wednesday, Good Friday, and the Fridays of Lent everywhere. That is obliged on the entire church. All Fridays are actually still recommended. National bishops' conferences can decide whether Fridays will be days of fast and abstinence. In most instances, for example, in the Western world and Western Europe and the United States, this is not the case. In many places in Latin America, Fridays are still meatless. And there are places, for example, in some dioceses in Poland, Fridays are still meatless. But individual bishops' conferences can decide on all the Fridays. But canon law says there must be fasting and abstinence on Ash Wednesday, Good Friday, and the Fridays in Lent. All right? So that reduces things rather considerably from what they once were. And the rules of fasting, of course, Paul VI issued a decree, Penitentiae, in 1966. So fasting is for persons between 18 and 59. Abstinence is for all above the age of 14. So those are the basic rules. So whatever day you observe, those are the people who are obliged. Now, the notion of giving up something for Lent. This actually goes back to the Middle Ages, and it was connected to the rules for fasting. In other words, in fasting, the idea was that you were giving up something. You were giving up a certain quantity of food, right? Abstinence, you were giving up eating certain things. I'm going to come back to that in just a second. So you're giving up certain things. So the idea of giving up something in Lent, that was it was associated with or connected to the idea of fasting. Now, giving up something for Lent, that's sort of like New Year's resolutions. Usually it takes us all about a week, and we goof somehow. And I don't remember any of you, when I was a kid in Catholic school in the 1950s, we had to give Sister our list of things we were giving up for Lent. And you wanted to be a real star, right? So I used to really work the dictionary. And I would give up rutabagas and kumquats and all to get a nice long list. And some of you will remember this. Sister would come to my desk with her hand under her scapular and just shake her head. You couldn't get away with stuff. But anyway, I mean, to be more serious, the idea of giving things up, whatever one gives up and however faithfully one observes what one gives up, this is connected actually to the rules of fasting. And it's very old. It wasn't something invented by the nuns who taught us a while ago. Now, the rules of abstinence are actually in a lot of ways more interesting. Initially, it was restricted to meat, but sometimes to fish and fowl. And sometimes fish and fowl were permitted. The rule of St. Benedict forbade monks the flesh of four-footed animals. The flesh of four-footed animals. And eventually, that became, sort of by extension, the standard that was applied to everybody else. That covers pretty much meat, doesn't it? Although it'll occur to you that doesn't include fowl. So that would leave chicken and duck and things like that in there, and they got out somehow. Now, until the 12th century, and this is fun, this is going to twist in several interesting ways, until the 12th century, eggs and dairy products were prohibited. After After that time, sort of all over the place, customs varied a good deal. Sexual relations were forbidden by canon law. The canon lawyers forbade sex. The theologians said this was a counsel of perfection. In other words, probably most people were not going to live up to this. And it is, for the Middle Ages, we simply don't have the kind of demographic information that would enable us to see this. In the 16th and 17th century, where we do have better records, there were fewer births in December and January. So this does suggest that some people observed this counsel of perfection. Now, why meat and dairy? Why meat and dairy? Here's Thomas Aquinas. They afford greater pleasure as food than fish, and greater nourishment to the human body, so that from their consumption there results a greater surplus available for seminal matter, which when abundant becomes a great incentive to lust. Eating meat or dairy products made you lusty. And this was not a good thing in general, and particularly not during Lent. Now, that was the flesh of four-footed animals. The idea behind the prohibition in the Rule of St. Benedict was that monks should not eat anything that was itself produced by sexual intercourse. In other words, animals that produced by sexual intercourse, you see, somehow left that mojo in the meat, and if you ate this would have, this is Aquinas and the Benedictines, it's not me. You can't make this stuff up, right? So eventually we've perhaps decided that that's not entirely right. So we got back eggs and dairy products and butter and things like that. But I'm going to come back to Easter eggs in a little while. Prayer, Lenten prayer, took a lot of different forms. There were special observances, to be sure. For example, the Mass liturgies for Lent are among the oldest liturgies in the Roman sacramentary. They're among the oldest liturgies in the sacramentary. So the Masses for Lent were actually written long before a great many of the other Masses for the year. The liturgical year has a temporal cycle that begins with the first Sunday of Advent and a sanctoral cycle that runs through the calendar with the saints' days. All right. So the point is that the Lenten celebrations fall on both the temporal and the sanctoral cycles, but they are among the oldest Masses in the sacramentary. Now, praying the 7 penitential psalms was very long recommended. So that's 7, 31, 37, 50, 101, 129, and 142. The 7 penitential psalms. So praying the right. So praying the 7 penitential psalms was also an observance of Lent. And what's interesting there is that this again was an attempt to permit laity to share in the life of the clergy. So the psalmist had said 7 times daily do I praise thee. So the liturgy of the hours, 7 times a day, members of the clergy will pray the liturgy of the hours, you see. Lay people are under no such obligation, you see. But if in Lent you prayed 7 penitential psalms on a regular basis, you were in some sense sharing, and there's 7 of them. And 7 times daily do I praise thee. I mean, sometimes these numbers work out in rather curious ways. I mean, if any of you pray the liturgy of the hours, 50 is the first psalm for Friday morning prayer. My sin is always before me. It's that really upper psalm. It's a rather grim one. Now, some of you probably in travels and so forth, you may have seen in museums and so forth, books of hours, these beautifully illuminated prayer books. Here again was an attempt for the laity to share in the liturgical life of the clergy. So they did not have the full range of liturgy of the hours that monks or priests would observe, but it had a part of it. See, it was sort of cut down. But when it comes into Lententide, the 7 penitential psalms are there quite regularly in those books. Now, penitential pilgrimages were very common in the Middle Ages. Now, one thinks of excuse me, I'm getting all tangled up in my cord. One thinks of pilgrimage and the great pilgrimage to Jerusalem or to Santiago de Compostela in Spain or to Rome. And there were always people who went off on these very long and quite elaborate pilgrimages. But there were pilgrimage sites everywhere. I mean, almost every church, had the tomb of Saint somebody. And that would be a pilgrimage center for people who lived in a particular locality. Ordinary farmers and so forth, they couldn't take off and go to Rome or go to Santiago. So Lenten penitential pilgrimages were very, very common. But probably for most of us, I suspect, the most familiar of the Lenten observances are the Stations of the Cross. So where'd that come from? Well, it originated in the 4th and 5th century in pilgrimage to Jerusalem. People began when they could, and obviously this was always a very small number of people, but when they could, they would make pilgrimage to Jerusalem and try to go and observe the places where Jesus had been. All right? In the 5th century, St. Petronius, who was the Bishop of Bologna, if you've ever been to Bologna, the great church in Bologna is San Petronio, St. Petronius set up 5 chapels that basically were meant to commemorate major scenes, major sites in Jerusalem. So this is the first time anybody thought of, as it were, moving the sites of Jerusalem someplace else. Now, they didn't physically move those sites, but in other words, commemorations of those sites were put someplace else. We have very little evidence for anything like the Stations of the Cross for a very long time, until actually the 14th century. It appears to have been a devotion particularly dear to the Franciscans. And in 1342, the Franciscans inaugurated the Via Dolorosa in Jerusalem. Now, if any of you have been to Jerusalem, you come in by the Golden Gate, and you come down that long street. You go down through the souk a little bit. You turn left. You go down a little bit further. You turn right, and you go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. All right, and the Franciscans will happily today take you along that path, and it's marked. There's plaques along the path. Now, that's all well and good, tradition again. So Jesus was tried before Pilate, and then taken away to Golgotha, right? Well, the Roman Praetorium is over there in Jerusalem. And the Golden Gate and the Via Dolorosa are over there. So Jesus actually had to have come this way. Not at all where the Franciscans walk you along today, but that's okay. I mean, it's, one gets the point. It all works just the same, I'm quite sure. The number of stations as the devotion began to spread varied a great deal, from 7 to 30. How many today? 14, since 1731. Pope Clement XII extended the right to have 14 and 14 only stations to all churches, provided they were installed by a Franciscan and a Franciscan led the worship. Clement XII. In 1862, Pius IX said that all bishops were accorded the right to have stations in any church in their diocese, and you didn't have to have Franciscans install them or lead the worship, and that's basically where we are now. Any church. Now, it's pretty rare. Well, actually, I was going to say it's pretty rare. Since Vatican II, you never know. Historically, it's pretty rare to go into a Catholic church that doesn't have Stations of the Cross in it, right? But that's actually a comparatively recent phenomenon, middle of the 19th century. So that's not something that goes back to antiquity. So as we can see with a lot of these traditions, they emerge at different times. They have kind of curious histories. Now, almsgiving was always emphasized in Lent, but never uniquely then. In ancient times, medieval times, or even today. In other words, giving alms is always a good thing. But almsgiving is particularly emphasized in Lent. I see the rice bowls around, that sort of thing. I don't mean to put you on the spot. That's a nasty thing to do. It has 2 towers, not surprisingly, many of them. One of them is absolutely gorgeous. It's flamboyant, late medieval Gothic. The other is an utterly plain, sort of conical thing. Doesn't look very nice at all. The burghers of Rouen had long had a deal with their bishop. Now, Normandy, right? What is Norman cooking? Has wonderful sauces, right? You make these sauces with butter. So the Normans simply were not going to give up their butter. So they paid the bishop a very large sum of money in return for an indulgence to have their butter in Lent. And the bishop used that money to build that gorgeous late Gothic tower, which is to this day called the Butter Tower. You go to Rome. I'm not making this stuff up. You go to Rome, that's the butter town. So that one example can stand for many. There have often been those who found ways to get around the rules. Now, there was Shrove Tuesday. You know what Shrove Tuesday, of course, is the Tuesday before Ash Wednesday. So from the Old English verb to shrive, to confess. So the idea originally was that, and actually Shrovetide went on for a longer period of time, but the idea was that you would confess on Tuesday, Lent was your penance, and you received Eucharist on Easter Sunday. So that was a kind of an interesting way of thinking about the Lenten season, and the 17 days before Shrove Tuesday were Shrovetide. Now, that's not a phrase we hear very often anymore. But if you ever encounter Shrovetide, it's the 17 days before Shrove Tuesday, all right? And that was your preparation to make a good confession on Shrove Tuesday. But it'll occur to you that there are some other customs on the Tuesday before Ash Wednesday. Mardi Gras, Fat Tuesday. Why is it Fat Tuesday? Well, because people gorged themselves. Because starting tomorrow, you're going to have to fast and abstain. I mean, quite literally, that was why it was Fat Tuesday. You just ate everything in the larder on that particular day. That's where it comes from. Now, in Mediterranean lands, Fat Tuesday was the end of Carnival, which would last about a week. In other words, you had a blowout for about a week. Now, Carnival is what in French, I don't know, can you all see that? Carnis Lavamen. So it's if you look at that and squint and look just so, you can see Carnival, right? It becomes Carnival in French and Italian and so forth, right? What that means is soothing the flesh, a solace to the flesh, a concession to the flesh, all right? So in other words, you had this great blowout, and this was the concession to your flesh before you entered upon Lent. So that's what Carnival means, all right? A carnival is a concession to your flesh, all right? But how many of you know that the day before Ash Wednesday is called Pancake Day? Have you heard of that? Well, remember you were going to have to give up dairy products and eggs, no milk, no eggs or something. So you made pancakes. Or punchkis, or whatever. I mean, you made, but you made, but in particularly in England, but also actually in Eastern Europe, that day is called Pancake Day. So in other words, there's a number of interesting ways to observe that day. All right, so obviously I've been circling around Easter eggs, haven't I? You see? Now, eggs go back a very long time, sort of in mythology and folklore and so on. But it appears that Easter eggs may actually have begun in Greek Christianity. It may have been among the Orthodox. That the idea that one would set aside a certain number of eggs, and then probably didn't take too long to figure out, they would hard boil them. And then put them in an underground basement or something, more or less like a fridge, and keep them, and then eat them on Easter Sunday, because you had done without eggs. Keeping fresh eggs for that period of time probably would not have been a very good idea. They obviously figured that out. There are signs, there's evidence that the eggs were painted. We know, for example, that King Edward I in England every year used to put down money for several hundred eggs, which he had painted and gilded, and then gave to members of his court on Easter Sunday. So the idea of eggs, connecting eggs to Easter, because you see, you get your eggs back at Easter. Remember, as long as dairy and eggs were forbidden, then from Shrove Tuesday until Easter, you had no eggs, you see? So the idea of getting your eggs back on Easter was a big deal. I mean, for most of us today, it's like, well, what's this Easter egg stuff? What's that all about? You see? Well, we don't give up eggs during Lent, so it doesn't have the same symbolic force for us that it once did. Now, it may occur to you, what about the Easter Bunny? He's Lutheran. He's Lutheran. He's mentioned for the first time in 1682 in the writings of a man named Georg Frank von Frankenau.
Also
Now,
name.
Sorry?
Household name.
Yeah, exactly. And it was brought to the United States by the Pennsylvania Dutch. The Pennsylvania Deutsch, all right? The custom came to America, and it actually spread among Protestants long before it actually came over to Catholics. I mean, curiously, that was something that we sort of borrowed off them at a certain point. So the connection, the Easter eggs go back a long ways, but the Easter bunny is a much more recent phenomenon. Now, how many of you know about Easter pretzels? If you go to Rome, you'll get these wonderful soft pretzels at Easter time. All right, it comes, the Latin word is Pretzeli. All right, that's, you know, we might say Pretzeli if we give it an Italian pronunciation, but in the German pronunciation, it's Pretzeli. That turns into the word pretzel in German, right? These are those pretzels, whoops, trip myself here. Let's see if I can do this. Shaped like that. The little arms, Pretzeli means little arms. All right, so there's Easter pretzels for you. Laetare Sunday. Laetare Sunday, okay? I don't know if your pastor does. Our pastor always has to say, we're wearing rose, not pink. Why Laetare Sunday? Well, okay, so the idea is, well, you get a little break. You have Gaudete Sunday in the middle of Advent. It's all been gloomy. And it's one of those interesting things that, with the change in the liturgy in the 1960s with the Roman Missal of Paul VI, we lost why this is Laetare Sunday. The introit to the Mass on Laetare Sunday in the pre-1969 liturgy opened Laetare Jerusalem, rejoice Jerusalem, from Isaiah 66. So the first thing you heard in that Mass was rejoice. Now we just kind of hear some song. I mean, if you think about it. So it's interesting in some ways the way we've gotten disconnected from some of our traditions. I'm not making some kind of an ideological argument about going back to the old days. That's not what I'm doing at all. But I'm saying there are some interesting places where we've gotten divorced from our traditions and we don't actually understand why they matter or what they ever meant. But anyway, as I said, the introit, the opening prayer for the Mass on the fourth Sunday of Lent was Laetare Jerusalem, rejoice Jerusalem. So that was Laetare Sunday. The third Sunday of Advent, the introit, the first word was Gaudete. So there was Gaudete Sunday. So that's where the names came from. Spy Wednesday. Gotcha. That's the Wednesday before Holy Thursday. Why? Did anybody know what the reading is that day? That's a really dirty question, but
What's it now?
Spy Wednesday. Jesus is in Bethany at the home of Simon the leper, where Mary Magdalene anoints him with the oil, and Judas got angry because he said the oil should have been sold and the money given to the poor. So Judas agrees with the Sanhedrin to spy on Jesus. So it used to be called Spy Wednesday. Not perhaps as common today as it once was. Maundy Thursday. Okay, so Holy Thursday. Why Maundy? You've got that on your sheet. From the Mandatum. In the Vulgate Bible, the Latin, the Mandatum, the command of Christ. You must wash the feet of others as I have washed your feet. The command. So Maundy is what happened in Middle English to the Latin word mandatum. So Maundy Thursday. Other kinds of things, the wearing of purple vestments. For example, they're only worn twice in the year, two seasons, two liturgical seasons, the penitential seasons of Advent and Lent. But the veiling of statues and images and even the crucifix. Now, probably a lot of us in the room can remember that. Do you do that here?
No,
Yeah, and it's not frequently done many places. Well, but it's not widely done nowadays, but we can probably remember that the statues in the church had purple shrouds put on them, and the crucifix had a purple shroud put on it until Good Friday. Then it was unshrouded for the Good Friday the veneration of the cross. In English churches, certainly before the Second Vatican Council, I can't remember now, pictures. If there were pictures of things, they were also shrouded I mean, basically, you shrouded every image in the church. So there were lots of these kinds of practices. We lose the Gloria and the Alleluia. No Gloria, no Alleluia. Now, there's another interesting one, and some of you may have observed this. You know, in an awful lot of parishes, I don't know, to speed up the liturgy or whatever, the Gloria and sometimes the Creed too are just kind of dropped sort of promiscuously. Sometimes you do it, sometimes you don't. And one of the things that happens there is you lose that sense of missing the Gloria and of getting it back at the Easter Vigil. I mean, that is one of the most powerful liturgical moments, it should be, in the entire year, is when at the Easter Vigil you get your Gloria back, you see? But if you kind of drop it all the time, you don't notice. But the point is that and that goes back actually to the 5th century. No Alleluia, no Gloria during the liturgy. So, in sum then, Vatican II said that Lent had a twofold character. Primarily by recalling or preparing for baptism and by penance. It disposes the faithful who more diligently hear the word of God and devote themselves to prayer to celebrate the Paschal mystery. Do you notice that's exactly where we began? The pre-Lenten fast and the fast of the catechumens. By celebrating and commemorating baptism. That's what Lent is for. So, again, in an interesting kind of way, it sort of loops around and closes the circle. So, that's a very quick history of Lent.